Welcome to Founders Grid, internationalization for business founders. Visit foundersgrid.com to join the community and to access more internationalization resources.
Hi guys, this is Chris from foundersgrid.com. Today I'm joined by Bobby Casey, who runs Global Wealth Protection. Hi Bobby, are you there?
Hi Chris, I'm here. Thanks for having me today.
Okay, so let's start with an introduction. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do at Global Wealth Protection.
Global Wealth Protection, that's our core business where we do asset protection and offshore planning for clients. We do consulting where we help people who are interested in asset protection and offshore diversification create the proper structures, and sometimes we help them find various investments. We've got quite a big network of people doing some pretty interesting projects around the world. So most of our clients are looking for, some unique investment opportunities and that sort of thing. But our core business is in the corporate services where we set up the offshore companies, bank accounts, trusts, foundations, that sort of thing. So that's our core business. And then our ancillary businesses are our conference business. We do a couple of different offshore conferences a year where we bring in about a dozen different speakers discussing things like, asset protection, of course, offshore planning, offshore banking, investments, second passports, those types of topics. And then our third business is our newsletter business, where essentially we take the conference to you and you get access to our panel of experts for various topics. So that's our business. My background is I'm an American. I grew up in North Carolina. I've got undergraduate degrees in finance and economics, and then also international business. And then I attended law school in Europe, and then I did a executive master's education program in entrepreneurship in the U.S. So I've traveled pretty extensively. I typically visit, 25, 30 countries a year. I spend most of my time in Europe. I live in Eastern Europe, in Latvia. And I spend most of my time in Europe and also in the Caribbean and South America. So I go back and forth a lot. Just actually on 6 days from now, I fly out to Panama for our fall conference.
Okay.
So I'll be in Central America there for a while, and then back in Europe. Then I'll actually be in Italy. So I do quite a bit of traveling around, and we do I travel for work, but it's primarily for work, but a lot of it's just living life in different places. So to some extent, I guess I would be considered a PT or a perpetual traveler. But for those of you not familiar, basically means that you spend a lot of time in a lot of different places and you're treated like a tourist everywhere you go.
That is my lifestyle. Cool. Okay. So let's go back for the members inside the community that have just started learning about the benefits of asset protection. In your opinion, why should people consider incorporating offshore?
Asset protection really is just creating a shield around your wealth, basically to give you some privacy and some legal protections around your wealth. And that wealth could be your real estate holdings, maybe your stock portfolio, maybe your cash, maybe some private investment deals, that sort of thing. But you create asset protection plans to give you some legal protections around your assets, which just basically minimizes your risk. And then at Global Wealth Protection, we're very keen on internationalization of your assets, and a lot of people probably listening, or if you're not familiar, a lot of people call it geopolitical diversification. There's been some books written about planting multiple flags, and we talk a lot about that as far as opening your offshore companies and your bank accounts and trusts and foundations and that sort of thing in different jurisdictions, so that you're spreading the financial love around the world. And so you're not actually beholden to any one country when it comes to your wealth. So why would somebody want to set up or establish an offshore company? Well, It really depends on the nature of that person's business. For example, if I'm a plumber living in Kansas, it's not going to make a lot of sense for me to set up an offshore company in Seychelles.
Right.
If my business is locally there with Kansas employees and Kansas customers and that sort of thing. If you're managing your investments that are all over the world, or let's say, Chris, like yourself, if you're a PT and you're doing work and you're living and working and traveling all over the world, or maybe like myself, if you do a lot of consulting with clients and your clients could be all over the world, then it makes a lot of sense to establish your company in a what we would call an offshore jurisdiction. There's lots of them. We deal with primarily Seychelles, Anguilla, Nevis, Belize, Cook Islands, St. Vincent, and a couple others. But there's lots of other ones out there. That's just the ones that we kind of focused our business around. But the benefits are, for one, the legal protections. For example, if you're, let's say, a German citizen and you're living in, I don't know, let's say Australia, and your company is registered in Seychelles, and maybe you do your banking somewhere in the Caribbean, you've basically planted multiple flags there, and you've made it much more difficult for any future potential creditor to pursue your assets, especially in today's age where frivolous litigation, especially from Americans and well, increasingly in parts of Western Europe like Germany, frivolous litigation is becoming rampant. And so it just helps protect yourself from this type of attacks on your wealth. And obviously, if you're awake and paying attention to what's going on in the world today, people, it seems, I don't know, maybe it's my perception in my world, but it seems people nowadays have an increasingly strong entitlement mentality where they think they're owed something. And a lot of people look at wealth. The only way to acquire wealth nowadays is really through winning a big lawsuit or winning a lottery, right? I mean, if you go survey a room of 100 people, most people will tell you, how can you acquire wealth today? And most people nowadays, they say, winning a big lawsuit or winning the lottery. You don't have a lot of people say, well, I'm going to establish a company, provide a tremendous amount of value, and make an enormous sum of money because the value I'm providing to mankind is phenomenal. Nobody says that, right? They just think they have to win it in what I call the lottery or the litigation mentality. So establishing that offshore company helps you diversify your wealth, and in various jurisdictions. Of course, we're talking offshore jurisdictions, so there's no tax, no corporate tax. It simplifies how you do business, because imagine there's no corporate tax, for example, in Seychelles. Well, there's no tax reporting. There's no annual annual accounting report to file because, well, there's no tax to be paid. What do they care what your accounting looks like? So it does simplify running your business when you don't have to deal with all the compliance issues running your business in that way. So it makes things a lot simpler, a lot easier to manage.
I totally agree. So what are some of the offshore jurisdictions that you currently recommend to your clients?
Well, primarily we work with Seychelles, Anguilla, Nevis, Belize, Cook Islands, and St. Vincent. Now that's, like I said, there's lots of other ones. We do some other ones in special cases, like people need it for a specific reason, like in Hong Kong or Singapore. We do a lot of U.S. companies, like in Delaware and Wyoming and Nevada, which, if you're not aware, the U.S. is actually the largest tax haven and probably the best offshore jurisdiction in the world, as long as you're not American. It's probably the most well-regarded company structure in the world, and if you're a non-American, can be the most tax-efficient vehicle for you to run your business. It doesn't make a lot of sense for Americans, though. There are ways to properly structure a U.S.-based LLC. As long as your source income comes from outside of the U.S., you can actually set up a U.S.-based LLC and owe no tax in the U.S. Now, the reporting requirements are a little bit more complex, but you can structure, for example, a Wyoming company to owe no tax in the U.S. as long as there's no U.S. source income. So we do a lot of U.S.-based companies. Primarily, we do Wyoming, Delaware, and Nevada for non-U.S. clients, and also for U.S. clients that have U.S.-based assets like real estate projects and some patents and stuff like that, so intellectual property based in the U.S. Offshore jurisdictions vary based specifically on that person's need, but those are the main ones we deal with. So if you want, I can recap that in the U.S. we do Delaware, Wyoming, and Nevada. Outside the U.S., Seychelles, Anguilla, Nevis, Cook Islands, Belize, and what's the last one? St. Vincent.
What sort of criteria do you look at when considering an offshore jurisdiction?
Well, for starters, if it's a non-U.S. person, we always consider the U.S. as a potential option, depending on the nature of their business. Okay. So I'm not trying to dwell on the U.S., but I know you probably have a lot of non-U.S. listeners, so I'll touch on this topic. For example, if you had a website selling T-shirts in South America, and you were a New Zealand citizen living in Portugal, then a U.S. company might be ideal for you because it's quite simple and easy to set up a U.S. company, and then you can even get U.S. bank accounts with merchant services, which might be your cheapest option. I don't know if you've looked into merchant services, but once you go offshore, it gets quite a bit more expensive. But we just analyze. Well, we deal with clients two different ways. Some clients come to us and say, we know exactly what we need. I need, let's say, an offshore company in Seychelles with a bank account in the Caribbean. Make it happen. Or we need an offshore company in Belize owned by a Nevis Foundation. With
so they're already educated on the
corners of the world.
Right.
Yeah. And we do a lot of that education through our newsletter. And through some of our video stuff that we have. So a lot of times these are people that may have subscribed to our newsletters for months or years or something. We've been publishing a free newsletter for almost 5 years now. So these are people, I get people that call me and say, hey, I've been reading your newsletter since 2009. I'm ready to do something. Of course, my thought is, really? It took you 4 years to make a decision? But of course, that's a bad reflection on me. Like maybe I'm the world's worst salesperson if it took them 4 years to make a decision.
There's a different way to look at it.
Right.
Okay. Pavel has a question. Is it possible for an offshore company to do business with companies in the US, Europe, and not cause troubles for later, i.e. penalties for bank transfers from the countries to offshore?
Let's have an example here. Let's say a Belize company trading with a U.S.-based company, for example, and the Belize company banking and conducting business outside of the U.S., maybe selling a product to a U.S.-based company?
Right.
Okay, what do you mean by causing?
Not causing troubles for later. He doesn't really clarify what...
Okay, so I guess I can hit on some potential trouble points. For example, taxation issues. Let's say you have a Belize company selling to, widgets to an EU company or a US-based company. Well, I guess that could also be based on scale. For example, if I'm selling $100,000 or probably $1 million or whatever dollars a year worth of widgets to a US or EU-based company, and that's only part of my business, I don't think that's going to have much bearing whatsoever. But if I'm doing $50 million a year and the U.S. is my only client source, you're probably going to be hit up for some U.S.-based taxes because basically it looks like you've structured an offshore company to avoid U.S. taxation, even though 100% of your business is tied to the U.S. Does that make sense?
Right. So it's the same drama that's going on with Google based out of Ireland and so on.
Google has that complicated structure, I guess. It's an Irish operating company owned by a Dutch holding company, which is owned by I think it's a Cayman holding company, it's kind of a complex structure, but basically their net tax rate is something like 2 or 3% in Ireland. They pay no tax in the Netherlands or the Caymans. And I'm not 100% sure on the third entity. I think it's Caymans, but it's somewhere in the Caribbean. could be BVI or something like that too. But clearly Google has entire departments dealing with their
when you're up to
tax
50 million
planning, right?
plus. Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, they have entire departments.
So
so you're probably talking about guys that are selling some digital products online, or maybe some e-commerce, some physical products they're drop shipping from e-commerce, or maybe some consulting, that sort of thing. The main thing is you need to think about the base of the source income. Are you getting 100% of that source income from the EU or the US? Are you getting, or is that only a piece of your income? And it's really, in my opinion, it's a matter of scale. If you're doing $1 million a year and $1 million of it comes from the U.S. through a Belize company, you might run into some troubles. But if you're, what we would do in that case, most likely, I would probably set up a U.S. based company like in Wyoming or something like that, strictly for the purpose of managing that U.S. Source business, and then have that owned by the offshore company, the holding company in, let's say, Seychelles or Belize or something like that.
We got another question. What is the best location with the minimum paperwork, but also with a good business reputation?
That's a good question. A lot of people like Hong Kong these days because Hong Kong does have a good reputation, but it's also probably the most expensive place to set up a company. And for banking, you're going to have to go to Hong Kong to open your bank account. There's no way to, I say there's no way. You could possibly use HSBC and verify your documents at a local branch wherever you're currently based, because there's HSBCs everywhere. So I've got a client from Canada I'm working with right now, and we're setting up some offshore companies for them, and they're going to be banking through their offshore company through HSBC in Hong Kong. But in Canada, there's HSBC branches, so they can actually go to the local HSBC branch and open their Hong Kong account locally, because it's just the know your customer rules for the bank. They want to physically see the person appear in the branch. So HSBC is one option, but for the most part, if you're banking in Hong Kong, you're going to have to physically appear in the bank. And I say this with a little bit of a disclaimer. These banking laws and rules with the banks, especially with the impending FATCA nightmare, these banking rules can change on a daily basis. So I could have just told you a lie, because this might have just changed this week or last week.
Right.
So
don't think it's changed over the last couple of weeks. I do keep an eye on Hong Kong. That's what I normally recommend to my peers.
But Hong Kong is a well-respected, well-regarded jurisdiction for doing business. Their paperwork, there is some paperwork. It's not nearly as bad as in the U.S. or probably UK or Germany or pretty much all of the EU. But it's certainly not as simple as something like Belize or Seychelles. As far as well-respected, I guess that kind of depends on the nature of your business.
Right, I agree.
And I get this question a lot, actually, because I was just talking to one of my consulting clients yesterday, and they had the exact same concern. Is that they had some investors in their company, 5 or 6 investors, and it was not a huge company, but it was probably capitalized with a couple $2 million, and their investors were concerned about moving the company and their investment dollars, obviously,
right,
to a jurisdiction like Belize or Seychelles or something like that. And it's honestly, it's perception. It's not a rational fear. It's perception. But there is some what I call irrational fear about having these offshore jurisdictions for your business. But if you're a one-man show and you're doing consulting, the client is doing business with you. What do they care about your registered address, right? I don't think that makes much of a difference. But again, that's just something that has to be addressed on a case-by-case issue based on the nature of your own business and what you think your clients, investors, partners, whatever, feel comfortable with.
Great. And I think this makes a good segue into banking. In your opinion, what makes a good offshore bank? And maybe also touch on what members should be aware of when they actually go to open up an offshore bank account.
To me, the responsiveness the banking people is probably the most important thing, because I dealt with banks before where you email them and it's 2, 3, 4, or 5 days later before they respond, or you have a scheduled call and they don't show up. That is very common in the Caribbean, by the way.
Okay.
The Caribbean culture itself is very laid back, and honestly, I'm pretty type A, and that laid back environment in the business culture doesn't sit well with me. If I have an appointment with a bank at 1:00 in the afternoon, by God, I expect that appointment to be at 1:00 in the afternoon. And there's some parts of the Caribbean where 1:00 in the afternoon might mean 1:15, 1:30, 2. It might mean 1:00 the next day. It might mean 1:00 the next week. We do work. Yeah, no, we do work with a few banks in the Caribbean that we found to be quite good. I mean, we're an agent for probably, I have to look it up, but more than a dozen banks around the world. So we open accounts for clients all over. So the bank itself kind of depends on the client's needs. If you're just looking for a transactional bank, you're just getting paid for maybe some consulting or something like that, or wire transfers and that sort of thing. And you're just using it transactionally to pay your business expenses and maybe pay yourself a salary from it.
Okay.
That's one thing. But if you are looking for like wealth management and you're opening an account with $100,000 or $200,000 or more, I mean, that's a completely different level of service. I mean, there are some banks. There's a couple of banks in Belize I would use transactionally, but I would never put $500,000 or $1 million or even $100,000 on deposit there, because they're not wealth management people. That's just not the type of thing I'm going to use them for.
Right.
So as far as offshore banking jurisdictions, though, I mean, for the most part, at least for Americans, Switzerland is off the table. And honestly, I wouldn't want to bank in Switzerland if I was European either. They're just, banking privacy is completely dead in Switzerland. There's only a few places in Europe left that I would probably consider banking for wealth management. Andorra.
Okay.
Actually, for wealth management, Andorra is probably my top pick in the world for a banking center. For those of you not familiar, Chris, you probably are, but for those of you not familiar, Andorra is a tiny little country between Spain and France. It's a couple-hour drive away from Barcelona. As a matter of fact, that's the only way to get there is through Barcelona. You fly into Barcelona and you drive up. They don't even have an actual, I think they do have a small airstrip, but they don't have an actual like commercial airstrip there, at least not to my knowledge. Andorra's good. Latvia, actually where I live, is actually quite good for transactional banking and also not bad for wealth management, especially if you're looking at investments in Central and Eastern Europe. There are several really, really good banks here. Sometimes people like the comfort of dealing with an EU bank because you have that €100,000 deposit insurance.
There was a discussion going on inside the Founders Grid community a couple of weeks ago on banking in Latvia. What banks do you recommend?
Well, the main bank, the one we're an agent for, Ritamu Bank. That's the main one we deal with, but there's another one here also called Baltic International Bank that's quite good for wealth management. Ritamu is good for wealth management or transactional banking. Baltic International is probably only good for wealth management. And then as long as you're not an American, ABLV is also a good bank.
Right, okay. I'll make a list of those.
Just an added note here.
Sure, go on.
We can open accounts for clients at Ritamu without a personal visit. We do that every week. That's one of my favorite banks. It's one of the harder ones to open an account with because it's in the EU. They have their due diligence is a bit more involved, let's say. But we've never had an application rejected, but that's because we're pretty thorough on our end on getting the due diligence from the clients. But it's probably, in my opinion, online banking is probably the best online banking platform, the safest, most secure online banking platform there is.
What is your fee?
Paul normally deals with this. I think we charge $500 to open the account.
Okay. Moving on to merchant accounts. This is one area that a lot of people have problems with, especially those that work online. What are your thoughts, opinions, suggestions on merchant accounts?
That it's a royal pain in the ass.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, merchant accounts, especially in the past 2 years, have just gotten ridiculously hard to set up, especially offshore. And you've got to understand, Visa kind of, they're the ones that are in charge of the way that industry rolls. Whatever Visa does, everybody else kind of follows suit. And so the way it works, if you're acquiring bank and pick a bank, well, let's say HSBC, for example. Let's say HSBC is your acquiring bank for merchant services. If I charge $1,000 today for a client, let's say you pay me $1,000, Chris, and I charge your card for $1,000. Well, HSBC has a 6-month liability for that $1,000. So in other words, if I charge your card $1,000 and I go drain that bank account tomorrow and vanish, HSBC is on the hook for 6 months. And so that has changed in the past couple of years, putting a lot more pressure on the acquiring banks. And so now the acquiring banks are getting much, much, much more restrictive on who they're taking. And then just, you've seen it too, the past couple of years, just, God, e-commerce has just absolutely exploded the past 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody and their brother thinks they can open an e-commerce shop selling, T-shirts and widgets and cookies and, shoes, right?
Right.
And it's just exploded. And so, and you've got to look at the other, like the higher risk businesses, which actually you'd be surprised what is considered high risk. For example, my conference business is considered high risk because we sell tickets, a high value ticket, and then somebody actually doesn't show up for the event for maybe a month or 2 or 3. So that's considered a high risk business. And we had to jump through a lot of hoops to get a merchant account.
Who do you use?
Just switched actually to DollPay. If you're familiar with DollPay.
No. How'd you spell that?
DALPAY, DollPay.
Okay.
If you sign up for DollPay, please mention our name. We don't get paid for it, but it makes us look good if we're recommending clients to them.
Right, sure.
We just switched over to DollPay, and they are somewhat restrictive on the type of businesses they accept, but it's pretty straightforward. It works a lot like PayPal. No monthly fee, no setup fee. You just pay your transactional fee. I think we're paying 4.9% plus 40 cents on the 9% plus 40 cents on the transaction. And I don't remember all the other fees, but it's pretty straightforward. I mean, you're not getting that 2.3% discount rate, but my experience is most of your offshore payment processors or merchant accounts, and I've talked to a lot of them, they want a lot of money on account opening, usually anywhere from $200-300 upwards of $1,500 to open your account. They typically want a monthly fee, $50 to $100, sometimes $200 a month, and their discount rates typically start at about 4%.
Okay.
And they go up from there depending on your business risk. I've seen some of them go as high as 10% on the discount rates. It's a tough business. That's not a business I would want to be in, to be honest, is merchant processing. But DollPay is a good option. There's another one called, I think it's ClickPay, with a K. They're out of the Netherlands. They're somewhere around 5% discount rate, pretty straightforward setup fee and all that stuff too.
Right.
Otherwise, HSBC does do payment processing, and they do it for offshore companies. So for somebody doing a high volume of payment processing, you may consider that HSBC bank account in Hong Kong and get that payment processing directly through HSBC. They're not my favorite bank because I'm not a big fan of big banks. And to me, HSBC is just like any of the other big ones, Bank of America, Citi, Barclays, all those. I'm not a big fan of those big banks, but if you have to use them, it might be a good option for payment processing.
I know you do a lot of asset protection. So when people have got cash, what do you normally recommend that they do with it? Do you recommend gold, property, or any other investments?
Depends on how much cash you've got, for example. And I just got this question from somebody 2 or 3 days ago. The guy said, I can't remember the exact amount, but I think it was something like $50,000 or $40,000 or something like that. He said, I've got $40,000 or $50,000 in cash to invest. What should I do with it? Well, I put on my wealth manager hat in that case, and we have to dig in and get a lot of questions answered. For example, if you had $50,000 to invest, well, is that your only $50,000? Or are you that's your only cash is $50,000, or is that your $50,000 of investable cash? What's your total net worth? Do you have any other assets? That sort of thing. For example, I recommend everybody keep at least minimum 12 months in cash, just cash. I don't mean money market funds or CDs or deposit accounts. 12 months of their own personal living expenses in cash. So if you spend 50 grand a year, keep 50 grand in your bank account in some way, shape, or form, and that's kind of the old school wealth manager approach, but it's not a terrible idea to keep some cash, because you never know when your business is going to take a major downturn. What if your business is, what if you're making $20,000 a month in your e-commerce and Google goes and changes the algorithms, and all of a sudden you go from top 3 listing to the 300th listing, and your income goes from $20,000 a month to $2 a month, right?
Right.
And you've got to bust your ass again for the next couple of months to get it back up. Well, you're going to need some resources to, eat and live indoors and stuff like that, right? Mm. Or, I personally had a business situation many years ago in another company I owned where my biggest client, which was about 40% of my business, sent me a certified letter on December 27th, 2 days after Christmas, saying that, thanks for your service for all these years, but we've decided to take, and we were a service provider, and we decided to take the service you provide in-house and handle that internally. Effective immediately, your contract is ended. And this has been several years ago, but it was about 40% of my business, which at the time was about a $4 million company. So that's almost $2 million, $1.8 million in business that walked out of the door with one certified letter.
Right.
And that's nothing I had control over. That particular company got a new CFO who decided to make some changes and did some things internally. So I recommend everybody have enough cash to live on for a year. Now, beyond that, if you have some investable cash, how big is your portfolio and what's your risk profile? Are you 25 years old or are you 50 years old, right? Because that makes a big difference in how bad you need the money. We manage some investments for a few people too. We actually have an investment partnership where we do some kind of unique things, and part of it we do is real estate in Eastern Europe. And I always tell people when they call me and say, hey, I want to invest with you. Well, our minimum is 50,000 euros, but I always tell people, don't send me your last 50,000 euros. I mean, you got to be an accredited investor with at least $1 million in net worth, and you've got to treat this 50,000 euros as if it's gone. I mean, treat it. I don't want you to have some emotional reaction if the investment goes completely bust. Treat it as if you can lose 100% of it. So if you have €1 million net worth and you put in 50,000, that's 5% of your net worth. Well, most people their lifestyle is not going to suffer losing 5% of their net worth. So it has to be that sort of thing. But as far as where to place your money right now, I could tell you where I'm placing my money, because obviously I can't give advice directly to somebody without having a better assessment of their situation. But
okay, that's a good idea.
Personally, I'm investing in my business, of course, like most every other entrepreneur. We're opening a new company this month. We're actually opening a trust company in Anguilla. So that's an investment for us, is opening a new company, of course, because we're, having to bring on some staff and pay a pretty significant license fee to the government there for a registered trust company. I mean, that's one thing, because for us, that's along our core line of business. That's something we can control, and that's the highest return on investment I can get. So if I put, for example, well, let's just say for math's sake, $10,000 into opening a trust company, and I can make $100,000 a year. Well, that's a pretty good ROI, right?
Yes.
That's my best use of dollars. But that also is not very good diversification outside of my own company, which I recommend everybody, as they are making profits in excess of what they need to operate their company, start to manage investments outside of there. So the other thing I'm looking at personally is, well, actually, hopefully I get an answer today, is I made an offer on an apartment building here in Latvia. I'm supposed to have an answer today on whether they accepted my offer or not. And with leverage, my yield on that's about 16%. If it's cash on cash, it's about almost 10%. So if I'm looking at real estate because, for one, I like having physical assets. I like having them diversified in different countries. So real estate is definitely an option. But real estate, to me, is critically important to buy it right on the front end. So the price is you're buying it at the right price on the front end. For me, I'm buying it with an expected yield, even at absolute minimum. If I had to rent these apartments at the cheapest possible rental rate I can here in this city, my yield is still about 7.5%. So my downside is I make 7.5%. My upside, cash on cash yield, I'm talking about, if I pay cash to the building. My cash on cash yield at the lowest rental rate is about 7.5%. At market rate is about 10%, almost 10% right now for a cash on cash yield. So to me, that gives me some significant downside. I can always have cash flow from this property in excess of my expenditure on the property. I'm also looking at precious metals. I look at precious metals as more like a savings account. If I have an extra $1,000 this month, I'll go buy maybe one gold coin or a handful of silver coins, right? Well, I guess what's gold now? 14 or 15, what is it now? 14 something. So if I had $1,500 this month in cash, I might go buy one gold coin, because that's my savings account. I don't look at gold and silver really as an investment. I look at it as a long-term savings account. And then the other things I'm investing in, I have some private placement deals I'm putting some money into that are just people I know, that certain companies that are, pre-IPO deals and some private placement stuff. A lot of these guys are guys that come to my conferences, and then we do webinars with them in our GWP Insiders newsletter. And then otherwise, I have just a stock portfolio, and I'm pretty conservative in my stock investment portfolio. I invest primarily, I'm only investing in big market-leading companies that pay significant dividends, and I keep a lot of money in there, and I just keep reinvesting dividends every month. That's pretty much it. These things are in different countries too, like the private placement deals. These are not in, actually none of them are in Europe or in the US. These are in different countries. The real estate obviously is here in Latvia where I live. I'm actually looking here in the next couple of weeks some property in Lithuania as well.
I love the Baltic states.
I love it. Have you? So you've been to Riga?
I went over to Riga quite often when I was about 18. I found Riga just by chance traveling around Europe. I noticed all the hot girls there, and I was like, so I used to go back, once a month for the weekend. Yeah, it was great fun. All three, and also Tallinn in Estonia as well. I'm a huge fan of. Beautiful architecture, great restaurants. I could definitely see myself having an apartment there.
I was just in Tallinn 2 weeks ago. I was just in Vilnius 3 weeks ago. I'm going to make a trip to Vilnius again here pretty soon, because I'm looking at some real estate there as well. But yeah, I love the Baltics in general. The architecture is very, very beautiful here. It's really, really nice, especially in the old towns. If you've not been to Vilnius, the old town in Vilnius is even bigger than Tallinn or Riga.
Yeah, stunning.
And it's very nice, very stunning. Yeah.
Where can people go and learn more about you?
Well, our primary website is www.globalwealthprotection globalwealthprotection.com. So that's globalwealthprotection.com. Pretty much everything else we do links off of there. We have several different websites with our other businesses on there. You can actually just click on the products page, and we have all our products categorized into different, like offshore products, domestic products, conferences, newsletters, stuff like that. You can also subscribe to our free newsletter on our main page, the Global Wealth Protection page, and we send out a couple of content pieces every week on various things about economics and investing and asset protection and news items and that sort of thing regarding your privacy and freedom and wealth. If you're looking to email me directly, it's Bobby, my first name, Bobby, at globalwealthprotection.com. That's probably the best way to reach me.
Okay, great.
Yep, very good. Thanks for having me, Chris.
Thanks for listening. For more internationalization resources and to join the Founders Grid community, visit foundersgrid.com.